What we want to get into now, we've covered those 5 steps, is our wonderful Productivity Pro hack for today, which is all about time tempters, and it's about making sure that you're making the right choice about where you spend your time. If you don't get this right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to feel like you're in firefighting mode. You're going to feel like everything you do, you're going to have to, jump to an emergency, and that a lot of your time is taken up dealing with firefighting issues that are not allowing you to work in your guru space or at a calm, relaxed pace. You're also going to find that you're going to feel bogged down by other people's work or demands of your clients at times when you don't want to be focusing on that work. And you're going to feel like a bit of a waster. You might feel like you're wasting your time on things that aren't important, that aren't allowing you to progress in your business. When we get this right, however, we can feel cool, calm, and collected about the decisions that we're making in our business, and particularly where we're spending our time. So you're going to get in a much better headspace because you're feeling cool, calm, and collected. You're going to feel like you're making progress because you're focusing on the right things at the right time to build your business and move forward. And you're going to be creating great choices. So instead of feeling like a waster, you're going to be out there doing the good stuff and doing things that allow you to progress in your business rather than the kind of couch potato stuff that's going to waste time. So without further ado, we're going to get into what's called the 4 quadrants of time, which you may or may not be familiar with, but by the end of this call, you're going to be very familiar with it. So I think the key thing, the reason I wanted to focus on this today, is that self-awareness is the first step forward. And often when we look at productivity, it can be easy to get lost in thinking that we're doing the right things and thinking that we're focused on the right things, but the reality is we're spending our time in the wrong places, and that can get very costly in terms of your business, your progress, and also your income and revenue if you're not spending your time in the right places. So this exercise and this productivity hack today is all about self-awareness. Where are you spending your time? So as I talk through these, we're going to work on the next page of your worksheet on actually identifying where you're spending your time and how you can stop doing that. So if you haven't come across it before, the 4 quadrants of time is taken by a guy called Stephen Covey. He's the author of the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Awesome book if you haven't read it. And it's a really good tool for working out where you're spending your time at the moment and how to prioritize your time more effectively to make better use of it. So it's important to know where you spend your time. It's critical to know how you feel about your day and what you're going to achieve. And so first things first, we need to look at the time management options that you have and make adjustments where absolutely necessary. So on the next on your page of your workbook, it looks like this. It says 4 quadrants of time at the top. I'm going to talk through each of these quadrants. And as I talk through each of them, I'm going to get you to jot down the activities and tasks that you think you're doing at the moment or have done this week that fall into these categories, okay? So there's 4 quadrants on that worksheet which relate to the 4 quadrants on the slide right now. Okay, so we're going to start off with top left-hand corner, quadrant 1. Now this quadrant is urgent and important. Sorry, it's not nothing. It's urgent and important. So this is where you're going to be in the firefighting zone. Adrenaline's pumping. You need a high level of energy to work in this space all of the time. It can be exciting to work in quadrant 1 because you can be doing some stuff that you're up against a deadline, and that can be exciting at times. But the key thing to realize here is that you're generally dealing with high levels of stress, and this quadrant is unsustainable. So it's okay to dip in and out of it from time to time and enjoy that buzz and that adrenaline of working under the pump. But if you are constantly working in a zone where everything is urgent and everything's important, you are going to burn out. And there is no reason why you should be in that space all of the time. So what I want you to do right now is jot down on this worksheet where it says, where it's got the numbers 1 through to 6 in those little boxes, jot down some of the tasks that you've worked on this week or in the last month that have fallen into the urgent and important space. So what tasks have you been doing that are firefighting? Maybe you've been creating a program or doing a piece of work for a client that is, you just got it done by the deadline. Maybe you're preparing plans for your clients or programs for your clients, within seconds of them turning up on your doorstep or getting onto a call with you. Maybe your client work is all under the pump. You're doing everything at the last minute, and so you're just about getting to their deadlines, or maybe you're not achieving the deadlines at all. So what are some of the tasks that you're working on or have worked on that are falling into quadrant 1, urgent and important. Now, some examples of tasks that fall into quadrant 1 are pressing problems, issues that come up, often are not avoidable. Deadline-driven projects, it can be last-minute preparations or dealing with crisis. Now, those are some of the typical things that come up when you're dealing with things that are in quadrant 1. These activities are really hard to ignore simply because from our life experiences, they've taught us that if we ignore quadrant 1 activities, we typically get into trouble. So that's where we tend to jump to them and deal with them instantly, where sometimes we shouldn't necessarily do that. And the tasks that fall into quadrant 1 are often due to a lack of planning. So it's because you've run out of time or you weren't aware of what needed to be done, and then all of a sudden the task has got an impending deadline. So quite often, whilst we might not like to admit it, it's our own fault that tasks have fallen into quadrant 1 and we're in that space of urgent and important. So what I want you to do now is with quadrant 1, it's all about managing them, looking at how we can manage those tasks and get them off of our to-do list as soon as possible, and ideally thinking about how we can actually make sure that that doesn't happen again. So for the urgent and important tasks that you've got written down in quadrant 1, what I want you to do is write next to them in the white box next to each of those numbers, what could you do to avoid that happening again? So for you, it might be better planning. It might be not working with those types of clients. For many of the solutions are for better planning, but it might be that you need to have a conversation with someone. A lot of the time the work that falls into quadrant 1 is either due to bad planning or due to someone else's bad planning. So it might be down to having a conversation with a particular client, for example, about the deadlines they need to meet so that you can meet your deadlines in a much more calm and focused manner. So there are different solutions to those problems. Just jot down as many as you can for how to manage the tasks that you've written in quadrant 1. Okay, so let's move on to urgent and important, which is the next quadrant. Not urgent and important is the quality zone. And this is quadrant 2, where you really want to aim to work as much as possible. I talk about this being like the luxury quadrant, because it can feel like a luxury to work in this space because so many of us are in the urgent and important space where we're kind of firefighting all the time. And it's luxury because it takes planning to work in this quadrant more often. It's definitely the ideal quadrant to be working on because there's no crisis going on. You're working with a clear head. The stress and anxiety levels are significantly lower. But the problem with this quadrant is it typically represents activities that are important, but because they're not urgent, they're easily put on the back burner, for when I have more time. And if you're not careful and not proactive, the activities in quadrant 2 can very easily end up in quadrant 1. The key is not to prioritize your schedule, but to schedule your priorities and make sure that you are clear on your priorities, and then make sure that your priorities are in your schedule appropriately. So I want you to think about right now, what tasks have you focused on this week or the last month that go into quadrant 2? And just jot those down on your worksheet. So where you have got quadrant 2, not urgent and important, top right hand corner, it says focus. So we need to create as much focus as we possibly can in that quadrant. What are the tasks that you are working on, have worked on, or will be working on, and they're going to fall into quadrant 2? And then when you've written those in, I want you to think about how to make sure that for those tasks that are coming up, what do you need to do to make sure that happens? Now, in most cases, it's going to be schedule in diary, block out, in diary, but there might be some other activities that you need to make sure have happened in order to maintain that task in quadrant 2. So for quadrant 2, it could be, the obvious ones are planning and preparation, but it can also be relationship building. For example, a lot of people leave networking until the last minute when they need new clients, where they should be prioritizing and focused on building their network throughout the weeks, months and years, so that when they need their network, it's good to go. So that is definitely a task that should go into quadrant 2. Exercise is something that is generally considered to be a quadrant 2 activity because there's no deadline to it, but ultimately if we neglect exercise for long enough, it ends up being in quadrant 1. It becomes urgent because you've got major health problems by that point. So that's definitely one that for all of us should be in quadrant 2. Okay, quadrant 3. This is where things are not important, but they are urgent. Now, this is quadrant of deception, as it's got on this screen right now. We get deceived into believing that certain activities are important because they're urgent, and even though we've actually identified them as not being important. So the word urgent means that the activity is either time sensitive or it's deadline driven. Now, an example of a task that would fall into, or an activity that would fall into this quadrant, is an incoming phone call, for example. It's considered urgent because the phone's ringing right now, but the fact of the matter is that the call may or may not be important to you, and you may be jumping to somebody else's demands or sense of urgency. So that's where tasks like that can fall into that sort of that quadrant. General distractions, you can feel like they've got to be dealt with right now, but typically they're not important. So if we cut those distractions out, we would not be wasting our time in that space. So examples are, unimportant interruptions and phone calls, emails, reports, emails that people send you with red exclamation marks. Just because it's urgent to them doesn't mean that it's urgent to you. So where possible, you need to be saying no to those types of tasks or renegotiating activities that fall into quadrant 3. And the only exception are activities that are important to someone else who is important to you. So that is the demands of your clients, for example. And even that you should manage with, there's a caveat to managing that sometimes we need to manage our clients' expectations as opposed to just managing the task. So in the context of Thrive, if every time you all posted something in the Facebook group and asked for my support or my advice, if I jumped instantly, then you're going to assume that that is the way that I manage the Facebook page. And of course, I can't do that all of the time. So your level of urgency is not my level of urgency necessarily. So sometimes we need to re-educate our clients around the level of urgency that we're willing to work towards and what they need to do to make sure they don't fall into that trap. So the problem also here is many of us are urgency addicted. So this can be a really self-destructive behaviour, because it means that in the context of quadrant 3 activities, we tend to gravitate towards them and gravitate towards doing tasks in that quadrant first because they're urgent. So we just feel like we should jump to it. So we end up doing tasks that are in quadrant 1 and quadrant 3 first, which is not always the best use of our time, and certainly definitely not in quadrant 3. So make sure that you're not jumping to tasks that fall into quadrant 3 that are urgent but not important just because you are urgency addicted. Really big waste of your time. So I'm going to give you a few moments now to jot down what tasks are you doing that fall into quadrant 3, or what tasks have you done that fall into quadrant 3, so they feel like they're urgent but they're not important to you or your business. So finally, quadrant 4 is complete waste of time. This is where you can spend hours on the internet. You've said that you're going to research something for 5 minutes, and suddenly you're there 2 hours later looking completely absorbed into Google and God knows what else. It could be meticulously filing your emails and having them color coded, and it just does not help with your business at all. Suddenly you're doing things that are not urgent, not important, and wasting a lot of time. A lot of to-do lists are like this. They're written up as a memory bank, and we become focused on doing a whole load of things on a to-do list that just aren't important. They're not urgent, and we shouldn't be focusing on them. But because they're on a to-do list, we end up doing them. They give us a sense of satisfaction because we've ticked them off, but ultimately they haven't allowed us to make any particular progress in our business. So this is definitely the time-wasting space, and it can also be escape activity. So it's okay to dip into this space every now and again. It might be when you go onto Facebook or you want to Google something, or you're having a peruse of Instagram, but you definitely don't want to be spending too much time in quadrant 4. So just jot down quickly now, what are some of the tasks that you tend to end up doing when you're in quadrant 4? They're not all urgent, they're not important, but you know that you do them. So maybe it is social media, maybe it is filing, maybe it's chatting on the phone, texting people, looking at photos, whatever it is. What are the things that you need to avoid doing in your business so that you are not in quadrant 4? And importantly, what are you going to do to avoid those? So in the box next to those, you've got up to 6 things. You can add more if you like. Next to the box with the number, so you're going to write the box with the number, you're going to write down the thing that you're doing that is not urgent and important. And next to it, you're going to write what is it that you need to do to avoid falling into that quadrant with that task. So that brings us to the end of today's Productivity Pro hack, all about self-awareness and knowing where you spend your time and how you can avoid time in quadrants 3 and 4, making sure that you manage your time so it's minimalized in quadrant 1, and focusing on as much time as possible so that you're in quadrant 2 as regularly as you possibly can be.